work. I'm sure everything is going to work just fine when it comes up. Most of it did. I've rebooted. I was getting, you know how you get like that OS rot where the thing's been running for, I don't know, the last week or something. And it's just that little bit slow. So I thought I'll give it a reboot and it will be fine. And then of course the camera didn't work, and then I was on the wrong YouTube page because I'd scheduled the thing beforehand, and then I rebooted. Anyway, we're all here now. Good morning all. Big Red, Callum. Oh man, what is he calling me now? This is my son calling me. Nah, I won't embarrass him. I believe him. Can't be that urgent. I think it's a uniform related thing. It's endless uniform things. Stefan's here. Good morning, Stefan. We're going to do a lot of talking with Stefan today about auto magic things, which would be really cool. I did actually remember that there was something I wanted to talk about that I didn't put in the notes that was significant and ties into a whole bunch of interesting things. And this is you got to say alleged at the moment, the alleged snowflake hacker arrested in Canada, which is really good news. Now, if we cast our mind back, snowflake incidents earlier this year, somewhere around 165 different impacted organizations because somebody managed to get into all of the snowflakes, which were the back end for all sorts of major systems. Now, the ones that were probably most impactful for us here, Ticketmaster, I think was the first one that I started doing a lot of press around Ticketmaster. This must have been about May. And I'd have all these journalists call up and they always ask these same sort of questions, how many Aussies impacted by this, or what could be the motives, all the same sort of stuff. And occasionally a journo here would be talking about Ticketmaster and they'd say Ticketek, because in Australia we have an entity called Ticketek that also sells tickets. And I'd have to go, no, look, you mixed up. It's Ticketmaster, it's not Ticketek. And then days later it's like, oh yeah, also Ticketek, caught in snowflake breach. I was in the Ticketek data breach. That was my name, my email, my other personal information, which was not great. Probably the most noteworthy one out of the whole snowflake debacle was AT&T. Now, AT&T apparently was a ginormous number of call records, such that the FBI asked AT&T to delay their disclosure because of the impact on national security. That's about the only good excuse for delaying a disclosure. By the way, we're going to talk a lot more about that today. So AT&T delayed their disclosure, obviously impacted a huge number of people. And of course, the hunt was on for this individual. Now, the individual who's been arrested here was in Canada, apparently. So this guy just here, Alexander Muka, who also goes by the name Connor. Now, from memory, some of the other things I've read have said he was 26 years old, which is smack bang in the demographic of, maybe even on the old side of the demographic that we normally see responsible for this stuff. Dalton's asking, why would one even hack Ticketmaster? Well, it turns out that whoever was responsible for this tried ransoming everyone. So in answer to the question of what is the motive, well, the motive in this case was financial. My understanding from the bits that I've read is that there seem to have been multiple organizations that have paid the ransom, and we may never know who they are. And there are multiple organizations that did not pay the ransom. I know who some of them are. I don't know if I can say because I was involved in breach disclosures with them. Now, why would you dump it? Well, guy's a businessman. He makes a threat. Either pay me money or I'm going to dump your data. I mean, it'd be bad business not to follow through on the threat. So unfortunately, that means people like me get our data dumped. So he's been arrested in Canada. It's not said here, but I would assume that the RCMP were involved there, the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, a group that we spent a bunch of time with earlier last month, actually, on our big North America trip. Spent a lot of time with the RCMP and the FBI. And it was just really, really interesting to hear about the challenges that they have. It sounds like Connor is getting a free flight to America, I believe, from Canada. He's going to get extradited for sure. I think the AT&T one will be the big one they sting him with. Anywho, all those agencies doing amazingly good work. It was really interesting to spend a bunch of time with the RCMP in Ottawa, the FBI in Pittsburgh, and we saw them again in San Francisco, talking about the challenges that they have, and interestingly how aligned they are. And I'll give you an anecdote because I think it ties into some of the other stuff we'll talk about today. One of the things that Charlotte and I spoke about and said we struggle with a lot is breach disclosure and getting organizations to then follow through, be receptive, first of all, to the disclosure, and then, of course, patch their systems, notify their victims, and so on. And one of the things we kept hearing, and from other parts of the world as well, is they said, well, look, we have the same problem. I'm like, well, what do you mean? Like, how do you have a problem with breach disclosure? You've got badges and guns. And they're like, well, we will literally knock on the door, physically knock on the door of some companies. You know, it's like, I don't know if it's like FBI open up or whatever they do, but they're physically there in presence and not be able to get through. Like, get the lawyer front, not be able to actually get through and do the disclosure and get things tightened up. And I was fascinated by this because, like, you're literally the 3-4 letter acronym agencies. Why is this a problem? But it is a challenge for them. So I'm sure it's very satisfying for our friends there when they do manage to make an arrest like this and find someone responsible for doing so much damage. And you would have to imagine that the impact, financial impact of the Snowflake incidents would surely be in the hundreds of millions of dollars. Tradie Trev says, follow the Bitcoin. Yep. that's well, you know, it's not always that way either. There are, and this is one of the, we're going to need a lot more than that today at this rate. This is one of the things that often spirals into an interesting discussion with journalists in particular, where they're like, is it all financial? And no, it's not all financial. There are very often people out there motivated by other things. And traditionally, we've spoken about 3 classes of threat actor. There's been the hacktivists, those who just want to go out and wreak havoc, the anonymouses and the lolsecs of the world. The financial actors, who Tradie Trev's thinking about just here, and the nation state actors. Now, the last two need no introduction, you know what they do. What's interesting is so many people fit into what I would classify as that first category, where they are not financially motivated. Perfect example, Ashley Madison. The Impact team, who has never been caught, might just be one dude, never been caught, made a threat to Avid Life Media back in July 2015. Shut down your services or we're going to dump all the data. And of course, we all know what happened after that. Data got dumped, got spread as far as possible. There have been subsequent financial crimes as a result of that, largely around extortion of people in there, but clearly the motive of the individual wasn't financial. Many other data breaches I've seen have been motivated by people wanting to see the incident come to light. Now, I'm choosing my words carefully there because it's almost a little bit paradoxical. If they didn't do the data breach, well, then there wouldn't be a thing to disclose. But a good example of this is VTech, the Hong Kong Chinese toy maker. Many years ago, someone found a vulnerability in their systems, took all the data and sent it to Lorenzo at Motherboard. Lorenzo sent it to me when it had never been pwned. And when Lorenzo wrote the story up, he said that the reason the guy broke into the system, how did he phrase it? I'm trying to remember. That was a lot of breaches ago. It boiled down to he didn't think the organization would take it seriously unless he took the data and sent it to someone else. Now, to be clear, this is not a good idea. There is a point at which you pivot from a security vulnerability, which can be disclosed to the impacted organization. It can be patched. It can be remediated without damage. But then there's a point at which it becomes a data breach, when the data is taken from the service and redistributed to other parties. In fact, one of the things we've spent a lot of time with law enforcement agencies about lately is how do we help the individuals at that crossroads where they're looking, they've changed a number in the URL and they're looking at someone's record and they're thinking about whether they should do it another 100,000 times just to make sure it wasn't an accident. How do we get them to choose the right path? So it's not always financially motivated. And I would argue that a huge amount of the data in Have I Been Pwned has not come from financially motivated crimes. It's come from curious kids who don't yet have the moral compass to understand the rights and wrongs, aggrieved individuals. Sometimes it's insiders. There's lots of different motives for why people execute data breaches, and financial is one of them. Mitch says, during your visit to Ottawa, did you hear any discussion about the CRA, Canadian Revenue Agency, H&R Block? If I did, I'd say I can't say, but I didn't. So we didn't have any discussion about that. So, to be honest, it's not like there were super secret discussions or things like that. There were a couple of specific incidents I did discuss because they happened right at the time that I was at the FBI, namely the moi.ai AI girlfriend-boyfriend generation tool that inevitably was used to try and generate a bunch of CSAM material. Gee, that went quiet, didn't it? We're talking about it a lot lately. That that one I was analysing about an hour before meeting up with the FBI. So we all sat around the computer and had a good discussion about how to handle that one. Let's put it that way. Sinskari. Sorry, apologies if I'm pronouncing it wrong. There was a data leak in Finland where the hacker got access to the back end of a therapy provider. Yes, that's Vestamo. I think some media claimed he got caught when he sent money to someone on OnlyFans. So this is Vestamo, the Finnish psychotherapy service. This must have been about 3 years ago. This guy attempted to ransom the company. The company told him to go and get stuffed. He went through and then tried to ransom all the individuals in there. So imagine the level of low life you have to be to email individuals who've been seeking psychotherapy services and say, send me money or I will dump your psychotherapy notes publicly. And he did dump it all publicly, and he very recently got arrested, I think in Spain. He is the usual demographic, 20-something-year-old Finnish guy, going to jail for a long time, as I understand it. Rightly so. Okay. What's on the list? Where's my notes? What are we doing today? Have I been pwned? I think we're going to start Have I been pwned. Now, we had a very momentous occasion this week. Stefan's here, so we're going to talk about some of this, where we finally completed the rollover from table storage to SQL Server. Now, this is kind of paradoxical in all sorts of ways. When I started Have I Been Pwned, it would have been about 11 years ago now, I got that inkling because it was the start of December 2023 that I launched it. Got this inkling about building a data breach search service because I had found myself in the Adobe data breach twice, once with my old classic Hotmail address and once with my Pfizer address. I was working for Pfizer at the time. And I thought it was interesting that not only was my data there twice, but it was with Adobe, and I didn't know that I had a relationship with Adobe. And I later worked out that because I'd had a relationship with Macromedia, because I was a big Dreamweaver user back in the day. Remember Dreamweaver? Anyway, Adobe then acquired Macromedia and my data flowed through, and now I'm in places that I never knew that I would be. So I found that fascinating. And this was at a time where Pfizer had done this thing that so many organizations do, where they go, hey, you're a good developer, you've been doing a fine job. If you'd like your career to progress, you've got to stop doing that and become like a manager or something. And the problem is I did want my career, because I'm a normal person, I wanted my career to progress. I wanted to be able to have that small single-digit annual pay rise and to be able to move forward. So I became an architect, which got me not clinically depressed, but let's just say very upset. I really did not enjoy just managing vendors and dealing with their shit. Although arguably that is the thing that really forced me to focus on InfoSec, because I just started pulling apart all the vendors' software and seeing how terrible it was, and that was fun. But I wanted to build something, which is why I built Have I Been Pwned. And I also wanted to, in my architecture role, where I got to make some design decisions for the organization, I wanted to drive us more towards the cloud. So remember, this is 2013, it's a long time ago now, and more specifically towards platform as a service, rather than just picking up machines and having virtual machines running in the cloud. So the Azure App Service, perfect example. I needed a database backend, and at the time, I was really lamenting the fact that every single time we built an application and it needed to persist data, the answer was SQL Server. It's like SQL Server is a behemoth. We pay a huge amount of money for licenses. It's this massive, powerful relational database with all these replication and query capabilities and indexes and fancy stuff. And all we need to do is collect some customer records because you want to sign up to like a Viagra campaign or something. Pfizer makes Viagra. That's the connection. So paradoxically, I was trying to get us off SQL Server as a default position. So when Azure came along and they had table storage, a key value pair that was super, super fast to look up by key and very, very cheap and very, very scalable, I'm like, okay, sweet. I've got 155 million records or something. Let's make Have I Been Pwned on top of table storage. And I started writing the whole process. And just probably an hour ago, I tweeted I think the original blog post I wrote about working with 155 million records in table storage. There was a bit of a pain getting stuff in there. You had to batch it and everything. I petitioned it so that The petitions themselves were named after the domain. So if you're john@gmail.com, there's a gmail.com petition. And then the row key was the alias, which meant that you could go and easily pick up an entire petition based on domain. That's what drove the domain searches. Or an individual email address by going to the petition key and then grabbing the row key, which was the alias, because you just split the email on the at. So someone's mentioned front page 98. I was definitely using front page 98 at one point there. Oh. Remember all the crappy artifacts I used to create. Anyway, so Robin's still stuck on the Viagra. You might have taken it correctly then, Robin. Anywho, so that was a massive thing, moving it to table storage. Now, I was curious. 155 million records was a lot of data. Can it survive? Now, we got to 5-something billion individual rows. The headline I have a been paying, what's it actually say at the moment? It says, I think, about 14 billion, 14.1 billion. That is, now it's about 6 billion email addresses, almost 6 billion email addresses, but each one has been in like 2-point-something data breaches on average. So anyway, we ended up with like 5 billion plus records. Now, table storage did enormously well. It scaled under pretty much any circumstance, with any sort of organic load, any sort of load from all the APIs and things we later created. The only times that we would start to hit thresholds was like loading a massive data breach and trying to push in hundreds of millions of records at the same time. It was fantastic. The cost was ridiculously low. I'm quite sure when I started it, the cost was, in fact, I'm quite sure for many years, the cost of the entire service was less than like a coffee a day. Now, at the time, coffee was, let's call it, $3.50 Aussie cents for a cup. So, yeah, less than $3 US. And it scaled beautifully. And it's really only in recent years we started to get to the point where this was going to be problematic. And it was problematic for multiple ways. Backup. Now, Stefan, chime in here because we've spoken many times about backup. He's wrapping it all in the marquee tag there. Throwback to the old days. There was no backup strategy for table storage. There was actually, in fact, Redgate had a tool for a while where it could do backup, which would run as like a batch job, and it would run AZ copy. You may know it as AZ copy. It would run this executable to copy from the Azure. I can forget, which one do I say? Let's say Azure. From the Azure table storage, and it would back it all up into a remote location. And then for some reason, at some point in time, that got dropped. But also our data was getting so big and you had to replicate the entire thing every time on backup. And we got to the point where the only way we could back this service up was that every now and then when I remembered, I would go into a virtual machine and I'd run AZ copy and I'd wait a week, literally a week, while it just hammered the crap out of this service and downloaded everything to a JSON file. Now, fortunately, we never needed to restore. But imagine having to restore hundreds of gigabytes of JSON via AZ copy into a new instance somewhere that took 1 week just to back up. It wouldn't have been the death of the service because people would come back, but it would have been enormously problematic. So there was no proper backup strategy. The other thing is, every time we wanted to do an ad hoc query, it was a nightmare. So, for example, if you wanted to query, instead of saying I want to query john@gmail.com, or I want to query, you obviously can't query gmail.com, it's too big, but like Pfizer.com as an example. Super fast, no problems, great. If you wanted to say, I'll give you a good recent example. Give me a list of people who were in both the Moi AI data breach, this is the one that had too much CSAM content in it, and the LinkedIn data breach. Give me a list of those people. You just can't. Like it's a nightmare. You'd pretty much have to dump all the JSON and then parse through there. It was pretty much impossible. Obviously, no backup strategy at all means not only no backup of the last known good state, but no backup to, say, restore to a point in time. You couldn't do that. There's no replication to other geolocations. What if we want to run a read-only copy on the other side of the world and then do queries locally there on that? That meant also no ability, if at some point we want to do things like have an EU-only instance because regulations. There were just so many restrictions around table storage that it was just getting enormously difficult to justify. And earlier this year, Stefan and I made the decision we're going to roll to SQL. Now, again, this is kind of paradoxical because table storage was there to try and get people away from SQL, at least in my mind. But what had changed in that decade and a bit is, first of all, very elastic level SQL instances in Azure. So we run on Azure Serverless Hyperscale. Sounds cool, doesn't it? Hyperscale SQL. And Hyperscale allows you to scale instances up and down with almost no interruption. I think we've got to, hopefully now, Stephen, we've got to no interruption. And then JD says, well, learn anything in life, and I haven't. It's to just use SQL. Well, it does make it easy. Nick 007 is in Bruges. I think I've been to Bruges. It's a movie about a man from Bruges, isn't there? So SQL as an offering in the cloud has come a long way. And it also means we have things, by starting to roll everything to SQL, it means we got things like point-in-time restore. Now, just the other day, and I can't remember why, I thought I broke something. Yeah, I thought I broke something. I was like, let's do a point-in-time restore. All of that data from table storage, we eventually got a SQL server. The point-in-time restore took 1.5 hours. So we know that for a database that I think is about 700 gig at the moment, isn't it, Stefan, including all the indexes, for that 700 gig database, in about a 90-minute period, we can create a new instance that runs parallel on the same server in a different database that we can then connect to immediately. We can roll connection strings over to. We can, if we have some catastrophically bad failure or do something stupid, we can get back really quickly with really limited impact. We can geo-replicate. We can save complete backups offline, just like we did before, because I can go into SSMS and export a data to your application, and that takes less than a day. I think I did it the other day. We do take offline backups occasionally. Stefan says 711 gigabytes is the real data size. Now, of course, that depends on indexes as well. And SQL Server, I think is fair to say, is a little bit black magic. There are so many tips and tricks and tweaks and things in there, especially around the way indexes are created and the way queries are written. A good example is the way we're querying this database without getting into the weeds of all the edge caching we're doing now. I think Stefan and I in 2 weeks from now will do this live stream together and explain that. We were doing a query which really just joined on 2 tables, but they're 2 very, very big tables. And you can imagine in your mind, if you've ever written a SQL statement before, what that join might look like. And what that meant is that when we were inserting new records when a data breach loaded, it was just taking way too long. I've closed my SSMS now because I rebooted. But let's say, for argument's sake, for a breach that was 1.3 million records, it was taking like 30 minutes to insert data into that table. So what happens with a 13 million record breach, 130 million record breach? And then Stefan made a little tweak with some very funky looking SQL. And then suddenly we've shaved off like, I think, more than 80% of the load time. So the joy of Stefan and I having our various Microsoft titles is we do have really good access to some really smart folks in there as well. So we have leaned on them in the past, and I know, Stefan, you've reached out overnight for some other things as well. So we've got really, really good access to people that'll help us keep tuning this thing, which is one of the best things about that. Wayne says, what's the SQL tweak? Stefan, you can explain it if you want in the text there. You can even drop the query in if you want, mate. That's not secret sauce. But especially things like indexes. So, we've got a situation now where we've got a table of breached emails. It's got roughly 6 billion email addresses in there. We've got a table of domains. So there's a foreign key to the domain. We don't enforce that constraint because that slows down the inserts. So I think there's several 100 million records in the domains table. And then we've got a table that maps the email address to a breach, and that's the one that has about 14 billion records in. So when you're doing a search for a domain, you're joining from a several 100 million record table onto a 6 billion record table onto a 14 billion record table. And we've got to do that really, 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 really fast because we know about it really quickly if things slow down because someone complains. So I think at the moment, Stefan, the last time I looked, our function execution time was about 60 to 70 milliseconds on the server side. So that is all of the processing of the application itself, including going to the database, running the query, and pulling the data back. So we're actually running very, very fast, and we can do it much, much faster than that because of all the edge caching we're doing on Cloudflare, which we'll talk about next time as well. So Stefan says, TLDR, SQL Server decided to not use the proper index when filtering which index to use to find missing email addresses for a new breach, and it also didn't do it in parallel. So we actually had a big problem with the degree of parallelism which was being applied to queries, so we had to explicitly set that. We also, to Stefan's point, found it wasn't using the right index, so we had to explicitly set the index to use in the query. It's just, it's dumb shit, which which is like a 5-second fix once you know what to do. And it just takes like 5 days worth of pain to get to that point. And because it's cloud and because it's scalable, and this will take us into the next part of the topic around Automagic scaling, we can add loads of cloud for if we want to add an index or load a breach or do things like that. But then you pay for the cloud. Now, let's go and have a look at what we actually have to pay here for costs. So if we look at SQL Azure Hyperscale price, one of the things I have always loved about the premise of cloud and utility-based pricing is that you get benefits when you're a better coder. Put it that way. It makes a really, really big difference. Now, I'm just going through doing the maths here. I have a price. Okay, so we are paying, now this is Aussie dollars. If you want to work backwards, GBP, Euro is around about half that. Take off about a third for US. So we're paying 63.5 cents per vCore per hour. Now, 63.5 cents sounds good, but then you got to multiply it out. So for a period of a day, that's $15. So now we have to pay $15, which at today's rates is about 2.5 coffees from the local coffee shop. I bring everything back to a coffee because it's a human relatable thing. $15.24 per vCore. Our challenge now is how do we use the fewest possible vCores in order to get the price down, but have enough vCores to be able to support the load. And there are several different things that massively vary the load on this service. The biggest one is, and again, we'll 2 weeks time now, we'll talk more about caching. The biggest thing is that when we flush the cache out of Cloudflare, we could go from a situation where just about every search for an email address or possibly domain is being served from a Cloudflare edge. And just bam, like that, suddenly 100% of that goes to the origin because a new breach is loaded. And now we need to flush everything out and start repopulating the cache. So we need to handle that. And then as the cache starts to populate, the load goes down. So that's one thing. The other thing is sometimes before we flush cache, we're loading a breach, which might be hundreds of millions of records. The SQL queries to insert those can be very demanding. And depending on the breach, it might be something that's really important to get out as early as possible. So how do we handle that? You know, often I'd just scale it all the way up to 80 cores. Now, let's work that out. 80 cores, now that is now $1,219 in a day. If all of those 80 cores are used for 24 hours. Now, if we're only using those 84 cores, let's say for 1 hour, we can divide that back down, and now suddenly it's at $50. And I don't mind spending $50 in order to get a breach loaded really quickly, get the notifications out, people start protecting themselves early. All good. We then have organic traffic. Now, organic traffic is a combination of when people come to the website, and sometimes that can spike massively. I've written before about when there's primetime TV that covers Have I Been Pwned, and suddenly it's like everyone picks up their phone at the same time and goes to haveibeenpwned.com, and it just explodes the number of searches. We also have a lot of subscribers that have very predictable cyclical patterns. I've written before about how the likes of 1Password and Mozilla use enterprise-level subscribers to then use the Have I Been Pwned data to expose it to their customers and basically get more people learning about data breaches. Some of them are working on very, very predictable cyclical patterns, and I think, Stefan, we've got a lot of opportunity there to help them work a little bit more smoothly. So we've got to factor that in, and if you get it's almost like when two waves collide. If we get a point where we're at the peak of a cyclical pattern and then we flush the data, you're at a massive peak. If we're at the bottom of a cyclical pattern and we've got a high cache level at Cloudflare, then we're at a very low peak. Long story short, the required scale consistently changes. Now, Stefan, feel free to start adding notes in here because this is very... I think the word I used this morning when I woke up and I read your emails, I explained it to Charlotte. I was like, it looks like Stefan's had like a total nerdgasm last night writing all of this code. I'll open up my Slack and try and summarize some of it. But effectively, what we've concluded, and I did notice a comment in here, where was that, from Robin about automatic scaling, Rubini R. There is not a native automated scaling within SQL Azure Hyperscale. And we kind of said a few times, like the whole value proposition of cloud was that back in the day when you used to buy on-prem, you'd buy a box. Now, I don't mean a physical box, but just imagine you buy CPU, RAM, disk and everything, and it's fixed at this size. And you need to buy it such that you can handle the peaks and you can scale and it lasts for some time without having to upgrade it. So what that means is on the day you start, it's massively over provisioned, so you're paying way too much money. And then you get to like end of month processing or something, and now suddenly you're spiking massively. So now you're under provisioned, but only for that period of time. And the joy of cloud was to have this utility-based pricing where you only pay for what you use. Platform as a service got us partly there, and we could auto-scale, can still auto-scale an Azure app service. So if you're running pretty much a classic web app, you can automatically scale up and down. Serverless got us there even more. Functions, for example, Azure Functions are serverless code. We push the code out and then we pay for the number of executions and the amount of memory it uses and for how long they run. Cloudflare Workers are another great example. You pay based on executions. We have no idea whatsoever how much of the underlying resources we're using, which makes the situation with SQL Server Hyperscale, again, kind of paradoxical because you're back to pick a scale. And okay, well, I'd like between 5 and 20 vCores. And then we find SQL Server maxes out the memory anyway, which then puts you in the top of that tier. And then if you want more vCores, you have to go into the dashboard and scale it up or scale it down, whatever it may be. Now, the work that Stefan's been doing is that we can scale based on a SQL command. So we don't have to be in the web UI, in the web UI in the Azure portal or do it through PowerShell. You can do it via a SQL command. You sent me a lot of stuff last night, Stefan. So for those of you who don't know, Stefan's in Iceland. I'm obviously in Australia. And it's actually really good insofar as we cover the sun, because at the end of my day, Stefan's always up and he's doing something. And then at the beginning of my day, he's still up. Like now, it's 8:34 here. Stefan, it's late for you. I know that. So we cover the sun, but it means that each of us gets up and there's just been all of this stuff that's happened overnight. So I'd encourage people to, and even if you listen to this later on and you want to know how this works, have a read of Stefan's comments because he's dropping more in here than what I have time to read it all. But what we're able to do is use SQL queries to look at the current utilization of the service and then also use SQL queries to scale the service. So what Stefan started to do is get very intelligent around writing code to look at our utilization and adjust scale on the fly. So effectively, he has built autoscale. Now, Stefan, you are going to write all this up, right? I put it in a blog post, share it with everyone because it's cool stuff. But it's not just autoscale, because for us, we have such specific usage patterns. So for example, data breach being loaded, based on how big it is and based on how long it's taking to load and based on how urgent it is, we need to decide what scale we want to run at. Database gets flushed, we now need, well, rephrase it, cache gets flushed. We now need to have a much larger scale database, but we also want to look at utilization. So as soon as possible, as soon as reasonably possible, we can start to scale it down and save the cost. We believe we can get to the point where we always have enough and we are paying the smallest amount possible to have enough. That's a good description, isn't it? So, a lot of technical discussion going there with Stefan. Have a read of that. Again, we'll get this written up, just like we have for nearly 11 years now. We'll keep writing about all this stuff that we're doing here. I just think it's super interesting for other people. I've really enjoyed the probably hundreds of blog posts I've written about Have I Been Pwned over the years, and I know other people have gotten a lot of value out of it too. And if you want to know something, drop it in the comments here, or later on drop it in the comments on the blog post, and we'll do it. And again, 2 weeks from today, if that works for you as well, mate, Steph and I will do this live stream. We'll figure out how to make 2 cameras work. We'll try and get some screen share and everything go, and we'll talk a lot more about the mechanics of how we've done this and all of the Cloudflare edge caching as well. Okay. On the next thing, the whole reason Have I Been Pwned is here. Let's talk about data breaches. Now, there have been a bunch of them this week because it's a normal week. So, where do we start? We'll just go through this chronologically. When was I here last? The 1st of the month. Stalker Online. Now, I've mentioned before, there's a lot of data that's been sent to me which, for one reason or another, sits there and doesn't get processed immediately. One of the big reasons is time. It's a hugely time-consuming process to verify and then, if necessary, disclose and go through that whole process. So one of the things I've done is I've got a list, and whenever I get a moment where there's not something immediate that I can go and load, and particularly when we're testing these processes, I'll go and grab a classic data breach. For example, Stalker Online. MMO game Stalker Online had 1.3 million records breached in 2020. Data includes email and IP address, username and hash password. 64% already have been pwned. Now, this is like very typical classic data breach stuff. Email, password, username. That must be the most common pattern in all of Have I Been Pwned. So that went in there. We got our notifications out there, 1.3 million people. Now, one came up this week, which took me a while to figure out what it was, and it was actually very large. Zlib. Now, my initial recollection was that this was something related to a compression library, which turned out to be completely wrong. So apparently ZLibrary is effectively, be careful when I say this, I'm just going to read the description in the news here. 10 million people thought, because this is like well, actually it's a July breach, but it's only just turned up circulation. 10 million people thought they were accessing an ebook piracy site called ZLibrary. Instead, scammers collected their personal information, passwords, crypto addresses, and possibly payments. What's worse, they leaked all their information, exposing users to other cyber criminals and authorities. So ZLibrary appears to have been like some shady pirating website. And then Zlib has been set up by scammers to scam people who are going to try and pirate the content. So a little bit of, yeah. I don't want to say people got what they deserve. No one deserves to be in a data. Almost no one deserves to be in a data breach. But that's what ZLibrary was, 10 million people. Another one here, carding website. I never feel it necessary to disclose to a carding website or a hacking website. Now, this was an old one as well. 2022. Email address, username, bcrypt, password hash, and cryptocurrency wallet addresses. And again, it's that same pattern. Email, password, username, over and over and over again. These are the 3 attributes. And if you think about it, pretty much every forum you sign up to is like, hey, please give us a username and your email address and create a password. And surprise, surprise, that's what turns up in data breaches. Now, the next one is a bit interesting. I lament the next one. Now, this is Dennis Kirk. And the thing that I lament is that I could not get a response from these folks at all. It is fairly recent. It has a lot of personal information in there, and it just bugged me that I couldn't privately get an answer from them in advance. Now, every time I process a data breach, I started doing this a little while back. Every time I process a data breach, I store everything I do as part of the verification process. So if anyone argues it later on and says, oh, this isn't legit, or, you've fabricated this, or got those facts wrong, I've got good notes on everything, including disclosure terms. So Dennis Kirk, on the 17th of October, I emailed customer service at denniskirk.com at 11:43 in the morning. Keep in mind we're in Australia, so we're probably in the future from where you are. You might be in yesterday. I then sent 2 messages to people on LinkedIn who work there. Now, I'm not going to name them for obvious reasons, but I can tell you what their roles are. This person here is a software developer, web application specialist at the company, still there. Okay, so that's one. I can normally get a response from LinkedIn people, but because the problem is that when you go through to some generic customer service email address and they get an email from some rando Australian running a service with a funny name, you don't always get through. So this is why I try multiple channels. LinkedIn here, the other person here is a software developer, been at Dennis Kirk for years, contacted him, nothing. 1st of November, I sent a tweet asking if anyone's got a contact. Someone suggested try privacy at denniskirk.com. So apparently they found a privacy link. So, okay, that makes sense. So email them, nothing. 5th of November, just 3 days ago now, I sent 50 emails to common subscribers requesting support. And then I got a bunch of responses from people. So what I tend to do here, I'll just find one example of this. When I'm not entirely certain about data reach, that the trick with Dennis Kirk was I couldn't easily map the identities in the data to identities on the website. So very often there are enumeration vectors on websites. And by that, I mean, you can go to, say, the password reset page and you can put in an email address and the website will come back and it will say, hey, we've either sent you an email or that email doesn't exist. Now, when you get that and you get random addresses and you test those on the enumeration vector, such as password reset, registration is another good enumeration vector. Incidentally, neither of those poses any privacy risk whatsoever because the email is sent to the account holder. If I can get a bunch of hits back and I know that random selections from this corpus of data are actually customers on the website, then my confidence level and the legitimacy goes way up. Couldn't do that with Dennis Kirk. It just didn't have an enumeration vector, and from memory, it wasn't even clear where the data comes from the website. So I reach out to these 50 people. Whenever I reach out to 50 people, I know that 90% of them will ignore me, but I'll get 5 responses. And that's pretty much the hit rate. 50 recent have I been pwned scratch. So this is what I say to people. I say, oh no, that was the one I actually sent to Dennis Kirk because I just searched for Dennis Kirk. Here you go, that's a good example. This guy. Hi, I'm emailing you as someone who recently subscribed to the service I run, Have I Been Pwned? I grabbed the 50 most recent subscribers to Have I Been Pwned in the hope that they will then remember that they use this service. Your email address recently appeared in a new data breach alleged to have been sourced from the motorcycle accessory store. Oh yeah, they do motorcycle accessories. Dennis Kirk. And then I go on and say, look, I haven't been able to get a response. Would you be willing if I send you your record of data and then you can come back and tell me whether it's legitimate or not? So for each of these folks, what I've then done is gone back and said, look, here's your row. In some cases, they'd made multiple purchases, multiple rows. And I usually ask 3 questions, and they differ a little bit depending on the nature of the service. So for this one, I said, do you recall making these purchases at Dennis Kirk? Number 2, were these purchases made in-store via the website or via other means? And number 3, has Dennis Kirk contacted you regarding a breach of your data? 100% of results said that yes, they were the correct purchases, they were via the website and no contact. So it has to get to a balance of evidence where the confidence in the legitimacy of the data is so high that it is reasonable to then reach out to these individuals and say your data is in this breach. Because inevitably, a portion of those individuals will then contact the company and they'll be understandably pissed. And I need to make sure that when the company does eventually realize what's happening and gets in touch with me, that I've done my due diligence and that a breach is only loaded when there's a really high degree of confidence it's legit. All right, brings us through the last one, Earth 2. So, let's just go through the chronology on this one. I made some notes. This is a little bit of a, this is simultaneously the least interesting, least significant breach of the week, maybe of the year, yet also the one that appears to have garnered an unnatural amount of attention for what it is. Now, maybe we'll just start from a tangential angle, talk about Gravatar. So Gravatar is an online service where you can create avatars, and then other services can embed those avatars in their thing so that they don't have to be the avatar host. I have many, many different Gravatars for different email addresses. As part of the key, the Gravatar is tied to the email address. Now, Gravatar themselves are in Have I Been Pwned for having a data breach, and I'm going to read what it actually says here. This was some time ago, and it is a bit different to the situation we're going to talk about today. So this is the Gravatar breach. October 2020, security researcher published a technique for scraping large volumes of data from Gravatar, the service for providing uniquely or globally unique avatars. 167 million names, usernames, and MD5 hashes of email addresses used to reference users' avatars were subsequently scraped and distributed within the hacking community. 114 of the MD5 hashes were cracked and distributed alongside the source hash, thus disclosing the original email address and accompanying data. Following the impacted email addresses being searched by an HIVP, Gravatar released an FAQ detailing the incident. So the way Gravatar has done this is that the consuming service could take, we keep using John as an example, John at gmail.com. They could take John at gmail.com, create an MD5 hash of that, and then that consuming service could embed an image, which was like gravatar.com/MD5 hash.jpg, for example. Now, the thinking here is that by doing that, it's a hash. You don't know what the email address is. But the problem is in the Gravatar breach, someone found a way of enumerating the hashes. So they've managed to get this great big list of hashes, and then they've cracked them. So how do you crack an MD5 hash for an email address? Well, you need a candidate word list. So if you have a large number of email addresses and you go through and you create MD5 hashes of every single one of those email addresses, and then you compare them to the MD5 hashes that Gravatar exposed in 2020, every time you get a match, you know what the plain text email address is. Some people go, well, why don't you salt it? Because if you salted it, you add randomness, so you no longer have a predictable hash. Well, you can't do that because you'd have to have the same salt on both sides. And if you have the same salt on both sides, well, then you can just use the salt to hash your candidate list. It doesn't work like that. This is really a weakness in the way Gravatar has implemented their unique references to avatars. So keep this in mind. MD5 hashes, email addresses, cracking, the 2020 incident being unique identifiers that were enumerated and scraped and downloaded. Now, a few weeks ago, someone reached out to me and said that they had data from Earth-2. And my immediate reaction was, what is Earth-2? Now, if you know what Earth-2 is, give me a description here in the responses. Tradie Trev also has said rainbow tables. So rainbow tables are pre-computed hashes. Now, rainbow tables used to be really, really big back in the day when creating hashes was computationally expensive, and you'd end up with these massive, massive collections of plain text candidates and MD5 pairs, or plain text candidates and SHA-1 pairs. And they'd be huge. And then you'd have things like Rainbow Crack, where you could feed in a candidate list of hashes and it would compare them, match it. These days, GPUs are so fast at creating hashes, as in tens of billions of MD5 hashes per second on consumer-grade hardware. We really don't need them anymore. JD says, Gravatar is fine enough as long as the email isn't supposed to be private. Well, I mean, this is now a good discussion, isn't it? Is an email address meant to be private? We'll come back to that. Is an email address meant to be private? Is a username meant to be private? What happens if the two of them are matched together? So anyway, someone can explain what Earth-2 is. My understanding is it is an online game where you can buy virtual land. If I'm wrong, please correct me here. It's kind of a little bit tangential to the data itself. But clearly there is a component here that involves money, as I've subsequently learned. I believe, again, please correct me if I got this wrong, believe you can purchase some land, you can sell some land. There is some sort of asset gained by being on the service. So someone reaches out and they say, look, here's a whole bunch of MD5 hashes and email addresses as a result of the way Gravatar was used on the service, which is very similar, but not the same as the Gravatar incident. The Gravatar incident was enumerating and discovering all the hashes that were on there, and then people cracked them. Okay, Robin R says I'm not wrong. Okay, cool. He also says they are building, he or she, sorry, says they are building a one-to-one to metaverse off planet Earth. So Fortnite, but on Earth. Who knows? Okay, doesn't matter. It's kind of tangential. Bottom line is we've got this collection of data. Now, let's have that discussion about how sensitive, how important, what are the expectations from people. I actually put out a poll on this. I remember now. Where was that? If I search through my records here, was it an x.com? You notice how everything that's twitter.com now seems... here you go. I found it. When I first saw this, I went back and I was like, okay, let's just go and refer to the original Gravatar incident. And I was trying to remember, like, what is the general consensus view of this? Now, I'm going to drop this tweet poll I put out in the comments here if people want to look at that. So back on the 17th of October, so this would be the day I started looking at this breach, I put out a tweet poll. I said, processing a new possible breach, and have a poll for you all. If you use a service implementing Gravatar and it enables your email address to be retrieved, match your profile and leaked, would you want to be notified? Previous reference, and I linked through to the previous Gravatar breach. Usually I have a good gut sense of what the results of the poll will be. And very often I'm putting the poll out as objectively and openly as possible, such that once the poll supports my existing assumption, I can give that to someone else and say, look, this is what people expect to see. 85% of respondents to that poll said, yes, it's a breach. 15% said, no, it doesn't matter. So as we go to discussing the sensitivity of the email address, because someone made the comment before, I forget the way you put it, does it matter or something? There's two ways to look at this. So first of all, the email address is a very personal thing. In fact, any data that you provide to a service is a personal thing. It's your data. You entrust it to them. Your expectation is that it's used in a certain way. If I think back to most recent data breach I was in, DigiDirect, because I bought a screen calibration tool. I think it was last week I was in the DigiDirect data breach. I gave them my data in order to purchase a screen calibration tool. That's how I expect it to be used. I didn't expect it to be sold for marketing, which as far as I know it wasn't, and I definitely didn't expect it to end up in a data breach. And incidentally, they still haven't notified me about it. That's my expectation. That's my data. Now, other people might say, well, I don't care. It's just my email address. I don't care that it ends up getting marketing material. I don't care it's in a data breach. And they have every right to not care about it. However, the assumption of the service provider has to be that when someone provides their data with the expectation of it being used in a certain context, that's the way it gets used. So my view of is an email address being exposed in a data breach of any significance whatsoever, my view is it's up to the individual who owns the email address to make that decision. And the assumption cannot be made by either me or the service provider themselves. Now in this case, 85% of people seem to think it does matter. And I knew it would be that. I knew it would be an order of magnitude more than those who don't think it matters. What's probably more significant with any data breach that exposes email addresses is the association of the individual to the service. Now, I don't think it matters so much with this site. And I'll be really upfront here, and as I've said to the Earth 2 folks as well, this is a nothing burger data breach. Like, it is such a minor thing. Ashley Madison. The association of someone's email address to the Ashley Madison service was major for obvious reasons. We even saw in the US elections recently some candidate somewhere getting shamed because apparently they had an account in Ashley Madison. If you're on a furry website, there's a furry website, Never Been Pwned. It's flagged as sensitive because your association to that is sensitive. Religious websites, health websites, those associations are sensitive. The association of me to the DigiDirect service is not sensitive, or me to the LinkedIn service is not sensitive. And I would assume that in the vast majority of cases, the association of people in this Earth 2 incident to the service is not going to be sensitive, with a caveat. I'll give you an example. There's another breach recently. I can't go into too much detail on this because there is ongoing work involved in this. But there was a breach recently that exposed fairly benign data, not quite as benign as this. It still had other personal attributes in, but it was effectively the email address, it was a date of birth, I think it was some other personal attributes and the association to the service. That data was then used to run extortion campaigns. So someone somewhere got their hands on the data, went through, emailed a whole bunch of people in there, and sent them one of those extortion ones about we've caught you watching porn on your computer and enjoying yourself at the moment. We've captured that on camera. Send money to this Bitcoin address. There have been thousands of dollars paid to that Bitcoin address. So the data gets taken and used in ways that even if its original context was fairly benign, can then do harm to people. Now, this particular incident I'm talking about did not disclose to a significant portion of individuals in that breach. Had they disclosed, at the very least, the individuals would have gone, well, I know that my data was recently exposed somewhere. So the point is, it is a very personal thing, but it is still significant when personal information gets exposed against a service. Now, I saw someone, I'm going to go through some more chronology here, but I saw someone comment later on as it relates to Earth 2. I shouldn't have listed username as being one of the attributes that is exposed in the breach because it's public anyway. That's not the point. The point is not about how public it is. I mean, for example, the LinkedIn data breach. LinkedIn exposed email addresses and password hashes. One of the LinkedIn scrapes later on also exposed first name. I think I'm right. Let's look. I'm going somewhere with this. You can probably see where. LinkedIn. Here we go. The scraped data from 2023 for LinkedIn exposed email addresses, gender, geographic location, job titles, name, professional skills, social media profiles. And you could look at this and go, well, hang on a second, isn't that like the whole point of LinkedIn? And yes, it is. But it's the association of, excuse me, in the Earth 2 case, a username which might have only ever been used as a screen name to an email address, which might be something that people don't want the association with. It's the association of the two that matters. So every time there's a piece of data exposed in a breach, it goes into a collection of what we call data classes. So in Earth 2, it was email address and username. And again, email address and username, particularly for a service like this that's not in any of those sensitive spaces, is very benign, which makes the whole thing all the more odd. So on the 17th of October, just as I'd done with Dennis Kirk and however many data breaches for that, I reached out via LinkedIn to the right person, someone actually not too far from me geographically, to try and disclose this. Got nothing. Crickets. And this is often the way with disclosure. Now, from memory as well, and I'd have to double check this, someone can do it very quickly, there was no security.txt file, couldn't find a vulnerability disclosure policy, all the usual stuff. Crickets, 8 days later, 22nd of October, put out a tweet asking for a security contact. Following day, I did get an email from someone in the organization. So we got contact, 26th of October. So 26th of October, what's that, 13 days ago now. Now, there was a lot of back and forth. And again, I would suggest more than what is warranted by what is ultimately just an exposure of email addresses and usernames. A lot of back and forth. And there is a number of different things that were concluded in here. And I think we've got to look at this in like two streams. So one is what's actually happened? What does the data tell us? What's been done to rectify it? And the other is all the parallel stuff around it. So let's do the first bit first, because that's the empirical, non-debatable stuff. There's a collection of usernames, hashes, and email addresses. Not every hash has an email address next to it because inevitably not every hash got cracked. There are 400,000 something hashes that did get cracked. So now you have an association of personally identifiable information being the email back to the service. That's not in dispute. That has not been disputed by the organization either, that those hashes came from the service, or, well, they can't really dispute whether it's cracked or not because you could always take the email address and hash it and compare it. So that definitely hasn't been disputed. Because of the amount of backwards and forwards, and to do the extra due diligence, I did the same thing as with Dennis Kirk, and I went and emailed a collection of Have I Been Pwned subscribers who were in that data set. And I asked similar questions to the Dennis Kirk situation. 100% of people, without exception, said, yes, This is my email address. Well, of course, because I emailed it to them, but this is my email address. And yes, this is the username associated to it. And yes, I did use that service. There is no question, and there has been no issue raised with the accuracy of the data itself. And I think that's really, really important. So that should make it easy, right? It has taken some back and forth. And look, I've had private discussions with the organisation. I'm not going to relay everything that's said in there. I am going to tackle some of the stuff that's said publicly. And one of the things I learned as I started looking at this, and particularly once I put the tweet out after not being able to get a reply on LinkedIn, I did have other people reach out to me. And the thing I've learned in this parallel thread, and I'm sure some of you are here now making comments as well, the thing I've learned is that obviously there are some issues that people have with the service. And that's not unusual. There's lots of people that get pissed off with the service for one reason or another. I'm going to have a spin through the comments here, but some of the feedback that I've had from people is there seems to be some level of upsetness, is that the word? Discomfort, disagreement, around some of the things related to the ability to purchase and resell or ability to get money out. There's some discussions about whether their concerns are being properly heard. And I know that's probably important to some of you. It is a totally different issue to the data itself. And I, to be honest, I have a degree of sympathy to the Earth 2 folks who are dealing with issues of which I don't know how much of their own are of their own fault. And then there is this parallel issue which seems to be getting conflated a little bit. So again, please try and keep these issues separate. There has been data exposed due to the way Gravatar was implemented, and that is separate to some of the other things that are happening. Let's have a look here. So Chris says, Earth 2, a financial investment platform in the metaverse, creating a one-to-one scale Earth in digital format. Now, again, keeping these two things separate, actual data and incident and what happened with the other bits. Some of the feedback I've heard does relate to whether or not it's a financial service, and that then, of course, has various regulatory implications, not to mention the fact that it deals with people's money, so it's always going to be a bit more sensitive. Tradie Trev, whatever happened to SimCity? Yeah, this feels like many decades of SimCity evolved, doesn't it? Whatever happened to Second Life, says John. Good question. Dalton says 80% is a big majority. This, of course, is the majority of people who believe that it's a notifiable data breach. What else is in here? Robin says response was more than nothing, Burger. Yeah, we'll get to that response. Someone here, Glasgowing, says, my email was used to try to make a new Earth 2 account from this breach. Okay, not sure how that happens. Yeah, keep in mind as well, like anyone can take someone's email address and put it in anywhere. I won't explain exactly how this happened, but just this morning, good mate Scott Helm and I were discussing that he had actually received spam to an email address that was in a data breach, and it was spam from a very reputable InfoSec company, and I know someone there quite well, so we had a little discussion, and it turns out someone had taken his email address, entered it into like the marketing form of this company, and then they had failed to do the double opt-in where they send an email and say, are you sure you want to get marketing material? And he got spam from it to this very, very unique address. Stefan asked Scott about it, he'll tell you what it was. Let's go on here. What else in the comments before we draw down to more detail? Seek, as many have said, I know they've handed this. They could have simply disclosed and let us know. That's it. I would have gone through hundreds of disclosures, many of which you know about because they're on Have I Been Pwned, many of which ultimately we were able to, for one reason or another, keep them out of Have I Been Pwned. Very different once data is out there in multiple hands circulating around. But there is a massive range of how organisations handle data breaches. I've written before about how the Australian Red Cross Blood Service handled theirs in 2015, another data breach I was in. And it was chef's kiss, beautiful, exemplary, expeditious, transparent, honest, owned the problem, told everyone what went on, and to this day, it just remains like the pinnacle of how to do data breaches. Not how to do data breach, how to disclose to your impacted customers. I'm doing another one at the moment. I expect I'll talk about next week with another company in Australia actually, and it's heading the same way as Red Cross. And I've sort of made the point to them, if you keep going down this direction, I really want to talk about this because you've absolutely nailed the way to do this. And if you're listening, you know who you are. So it can be a very smooth, low friction process. The narrative behind this, and we'll actually get to some of their responses later on because they did put a response on Twitter. The narrative behind this is that it's one of these, frankly, very innocent mistakes, but it is something that ultimately the organization you provide your data to is accountable for, regardless of the downstream services they then use. We'll get to that. What else in the comments? Almost through. Glasgow says they didn't handle it bad. They kind of didn't handle it at all. Well, they're handling it now. So this kind of brings us to where we are. What else is here? Nearly here. Callum's saying this is a rabbit hole. Trying to make this adventure. Dalton says, Troy, the question is, what did E2 say? What did they not agree to Why did they not agree to disclose this? Well, okay, good question. I've got the narrative that I've had with them in here. And again, I'm not going to relay private messaging that I don't need to, that's not addressed publicly or that's not relevant to this breach. But what I will say is that from the outset, I have asked for a disclosure statement I can link to. So my preference, whenever I'm loading a data breach, there's a chronology with all of them. Someone sends me data, I verify it with enough confidence to believe that it's worthwhile disclosing to the organization if it's not already in the press or I haven't seen them disclose it already. And one of the first things I try and do is get them to the point of doing their disclosure first. I want to see, perfect world, I want to see a statement from them that says, this is what's happened, this is what was exposed, this is what we've done to address it, this is what you should do to protect yourself, in a nutshell. I would ideally like to see the individuals impacted by that breach notified and sent to there, get all of that done, and then I'll notify our subscribers. So keep in mind as well, our subscribers are a combination of the individual owner of the email address, and when they work for an organization that owns that email address and they do domain searches, they get told as well. Because let's say Dropbox was a great example. Dropbox happened, the actual breach itself happened whilst I was at Pfizer. Now, that was not a sanctioned cloud storage service. If we knew there were people in the organization using Pfizer.com email addresses on Dropbox, that's a really, really important thing for our organization, because you could have been exfiltrating the secret herbs and spices of Viagra, or whatever it is they put in there. I don't know, that wasn't my job. So anyway, they get notified as well. So that the point is that even post-notification from an organization, the have been pwned notifications are important. They're also important because later on, when someone's getting account takeover attacks or spam or things like that, being able to look up and see all the different places they're exposed is important. I always want that communication to come from the organization first. And one of the reasons I explained to the organization is why this is important, and we didn't get into the weeds of this discussion here, but in general, is that by putting out a statement, they get to set the narrative. Charlotte's profession is PR. I don't know if we've ever talked about this. But Charlotte, my wife and COO of Have I Been Pwned, is a PR person. We've had many discussions about this, about the importance of the company owning the narrative. So when a data breach happens and they're able to say, look, this is what happened. And how many times have I shared data breach disclosure notices online and we've all gone through and said, oh, well, this bit was good and that bit was bad, whatever. So I try and get organizations to the point of having that disclosure notice out so that I can link to that. Now, if I can't link to that, I'd love to link to a news piece about it. Very often I talk to journalists about incidents. This is not even newsworthy. It really is not. So there's no news about it. So in this case, it was just a simple statement of fact, and we'll come back to that in a moment. So in answer to that original question back here, scroll down. Did you get a chance to, I'm going to come back to that response online at the moment. But someone asking about, I've lost it now because there's too many messages here. But anyway, the question was about them disclosing. So I did push for disclosure. That would have been my number one preference. In lieu of not having that, I gave them a heads up last week about the messaging that I would use in the notice to our subscribers. And I'm just spinning through the email thread here. So the four things that I said to me were important in the messaging. So number one, the root cause of the incident relates to how Gravatar images are embedded in consuming services. We've had that discussion. Everyone knows what it means. Now, number two, this is important, and we'll come back to this again shortly. Earth-2 has disabled the possibility of this data being made available. So the root cause has been rectified. And good job. That's exactly what they should do. Fix that problem up. Number three, the full extent of the incident amounts to email addresses and username pairs being exposed. Like, that is it. And that is what makes this a bit of a nothing burger. Number four, there has never been a risk of password, financial, or other PII data being compromised. So these are the 4 points that I laid out. In fact, the 2nd of November, I laid that out 6 days ago. So this is what will go into our disclosure message. So they're aware of that. Earlier yesterday, so what tends to happen, because there's such a pipeline of data breaches, and already in this live stream we've spoken about a bunch that came before this, I tend to do them very sequentially in terms of writing up the full description and publishing it. So earlier yesterday, I wrote up the full description that goes into the notices, that goes on the websites, sent that off. Many hours later, loaded the data breach notices went out, which I thought was pretty much exactly what had been discussed. Now, there appears to be some contention with the notices. And in fact, I think it was something like half an hour or more after I'd sent the notice, they came back and had rewritten my disclosure notice. Now, I'm just not going to allow organisations to, in their own words, describe something which is a factual observation. And in this case, again, it was very simple. Go back to track 1. It's very simple what happened, very simple what was in there. So it's 4 points. I'm going to read you what was in the disclosure notice. This is actually in, where are we here? Earth-2. I will permalink to it as well so that everyone can follow along at home. So this is the Have I Been Pwned description. In October 2024, 421,000 unique email addresses from the virtual Earth game, Earth-2, were derived from embedded Gravatar images. So it was one of the points that's what I was going to make. Appearing alongside player usernames, the root cause was related to how Gravatar presents links to avatars as MD5 hashes within consuming services, a feature Earth-2 advised has now been disabled on the platform. Number 2, the incident did not expose any further personal information, passwords, or financial data. Number 3, there were 4. Well, the other one here really was that the full extent is just email addresses and username pairs. So, to be honest, adding the bit about not exposing further personal information, passwords, or financial data, I don't normally do that. I don't create lists of the things that aren't in the data. Imagine if I did that. There's, I think, 140 data classes now and Have I Been Pwned. Imagine if for every breach I'm like, email addresses, usernames, and passwords. But there were no sexual orientations or dates of birth, or like it could go on and on. And I put that in there to emphasize the insignificance of this. That's what's on Have I Been Pwned. That's what was emailed out to our subscribers. When a breach goes into Have I Been Pwned, I put out a tweet. I keep that tweet within 280 characters, otherwise it scrolls off. I'm going to read you the tweet. Running out of tabs. Why do I keep going to twitter.com? I can't help it. X.com. So the tweet is, of course, going to be a summary of that because of the 280 character limit, as well as the mention of Have I Been Pwned, as well as the percentage, which I always put in there. New breach, Earth-2 had 421,000 email addresses derived from embedded Gravatar images exposed last month. The data appeared alongside usernames from the service. 73% were already in Have I Been Pwned. Again, perfectly accurate. There is information that is not in there that is in the longer version. The longer version doesn't contain a whole bunch of other information which is unrelated to the raw data itself. Now, to me, that seemed pretty much like every other data breach, well, 800 something data breaches that are in there that for the most part are non-eventful. Every now and then something gets a bit more attention, like this one. Now, after I put this out and we had some more correspondence, I did explain that to them. And I want to just be clear about the timelines here. I did actually wonder whether I should write something up about this or put out a tweet, but honestly, I think it just deserves a verbal discussion. And it just doesn't warrant the time to sit there and document the minutiae of this. Regardless, I got a query from them querying this description at 4:04 my time yesterday. And then I explained, because they were sort of saying, well, you know, where's the bit about no passwords, etc. Well, that's what went in the notifications. That's the full description. A tweet is a subset of that. Explained all that. This was at 4:04. Now, I had people reach out to me, and again, when we move on to this other track about the other noise around Earth 2, which frankly is unrelated to the data breach. Obviously, a bunch of people looking at this service in general. A bunch of people reached out and said messages in Discord about this are being deleted, which is not a good look. Now, to be fair, I don't know, and someone could probably tell me in the comments, I don't know if it's the owners and operators of the service, which are also the mods on Discord. So maybe it wasn't them deleting the messages on Discord. I don't know. However, at the very least, because people sent me through screen caps of this, at 4:53, so this is now, 49 minutes after I had explained to them that here's the full description. It's there. Don't worry. It's exactly what we discussed. We've got people deleting messages on Discord that had that full description in there. So absolutely, somewhere between 4 and 5 p.m., people know what the full description is and have deleted the messages. Now, at 6:48, so nearly 3 hours after I explained, look, here's the full description, there was a really, really long message. I mean, I know tweets can be more than 280 characters, but holy cow, it's a really long message from them in response to Have I Been Pwned's succinct tweet where they take issues with some things. So let's go through and talk about some of these. And in fact, before I do that, let me get through the last of my coffee because it does feel like it's been a long day while I look at some of these comments. Yeah, it's cold now. It's a nice coffee. Stefan, fun fact. I used to work at CCP Games. You make Eve Online. And I messed up one day, causing users to log into the wrong account. You didn't tell me this before we hired you. Jeez. Sure, it's fun. And the other replies. I don't think there's anything else here that really needs verbalizing. The Vive person here says E2 players have become defensive of E2 because people like Callan Upton and others have gone out of their way to destroy the project for views. Now, again, let's keep that in that other the data breach category. That's the, what do we call this? The points of contention with the platform in general category. And I'd really encourage everyone to try and focus on the facts. One of the things that I've said so many times about data breaches when there's been particularly pushback from an organization is that the truth is in the data. This is sort of this like beautiful aspect of it, which is when you have the raw data sitting there and you see what is there. Let's say in previous cases, I remember the AA in the UK, Automobile Association, had argued that there were no credit card data exposed in a breach. It's like, well, yeah, they were. Like it's right here. The truth is in the data. Let's keep it focused on this. All right. Tradie Cho says, nearly 10 a.m. The pub will be up. I know, mate. We're going way too long. So I'm not going to go through the whole thing because otherwise, Tradie Trev, it will be 10 p.m. But there are many, many points made in this response here. Frankly, many of them say the same thing. Earth2 confirmed with you that we use industry-established third-party authentication. So there's a bit of a theme here, which is around the authentication provider and the link to Gravatar. These established third-party authentication providers find it safe enough to use Gravatar. Earth2 has never contacted or used services directly from Gravatar. I think that the reasonable way to put the theme is that they're using a service here which implemented Gravatar, and that is the point of exposure. Now, earlier on, right at the beginning of this podcast video, whatever it is, we were talking about Snowflake. 165 instances of organizations being compromised in Snowflake. If we were to pick, let's say pick Ticketmaster as an example, because everyone knows who they are. It is not Ticketmaster's fault that the data breach happened and that their information was exposed. Ticketmaster is the organization that was entrusted by their customers with the data. They become the data processor for those customers. The accountability lies with them, regardless of which downstream services they now use. If Stripe gets owned sideways tomorrow and all of our customer data who bought API keys or things like that gets exposed, that's our responsibility to communicate. That will be in my disclosure notice because I would write that sucker up big, I tell you. But it is our responsibility to explain what happened to our customers because we're the ones that got entrusted with the data. So I'm sympathetic for organisations who have entrusted a third party that have, in this case, inadvertently led to the exposure of the data. I don't disagree with any of this, but it doesn't absolve you from responsibility. And that's the key point here. So there's a lot of bullet points here. 1, 2, 3, all the same thing. Number 4, you've already disclosed a Gravatar breach in 2020, but that was a different thing. Similar in that the exposure of hashes used for avatars can be cracked and resolved back to plain text. But enumerating identities to expose over 100 million, in that case, hashes, is a different situation to being able to go through the platform and find users and Gravatar images and associate them back to one specific service. The Gravatar incident didn't expose which services the individuals were using. When you disclosed the original breach 4 years ago, Earth 2 had not even publicly launched. Again, not relevant to this. It would be the responsibility of Gravatar and our third-party providers who directly knowingly use Gravatar to ensure the issue is satisfactorily resolved. In part, I've got examples for everything. Some good examples. I've had many instances where there has been a data breach of, let's take Snowflake as an example. Did any of you get a disclosure notice from Snowflake? Leave it in the comments if you got one from Snowflake. Now, the answer will be no. And the reason why the answer is no is because Snowflake doesn't have the relationship with the customer, the end user customer. I was in the Ticketek data breach. I got a disclosure email from Ticketek due to the Snowflake incident. Snowflake doesn't have, I'm going to choose my words carefully, is it the legal right or the obligation? Yeah, you know what I mean. The relationship is with me. So Ticketek can email me. They are the data processor. They've then used other processors with their data, in this case Snowflake. Snowflake themselves don't have that relationship to me. That's why you don't get disclosures from the likes of Snowflake every time you're in Ticketek or Ticketmaster or AT&T or any of these others. So we've got to be a little bit careful about where there is responsibility for different things. And I do agree with them. It is responsibility of those third-party providers, etc., to make sure that things are resolved and secure and everything else. And this is why, I mean, we're seeing the likes of Delta go after CrowdStrike now for outages. Whole other story. But the point is that there is recourse from organizations to the partners that they trust when the job isn't done properly. That's between you guys and Gravatar. What's between you and your customers is the fact that customers entrusted you with data, and then due to this incident, it was exposed. Now, apparently I failed to mention that after I reached out to us, the developers immediately removed any use of Gravatar images. I think part of the problem here is whoever wrote this, almost 3 hours after I had emailed them to say, here is the full description, has not realized that the full description and the disclosure email that went to our subscribers does specifically mention this. And again, the fact that a couple of hours before this tweet was sent, those messages with that full disclosure notice were being deleted out of the Discord channel doesn't look good, if I'm honest. It looks bad. So I did disclose that. That is in the emails. Now, incidentally, we had more than 6,000 of our subscribers in that data set. We've got just over 5 million subscribers. We find that as a rule of thumb, roughly 1% of a breach corpus is our subscribers. So they had, 420,000 something people in there. So this would be maybe 1.5% of their subscribers have been paying subscribers. I'd argue they're a little bit more in the techie space, Earth 2, so we're probably going to have a higher hit rate there. So that was disclosed, that went out to everyone, and that was also communicated back to Earth 2 hours before this tweet was made. Next one here. You failed to mention the data provided to you was from an anonymous source who did not want to properly identify themselves. That's where most data breaches come from, if I'm honest. Most data breaches come from individuals who don't want to be identified. And there are various reasons for this. Actually, let's take a step back. Where do most data breaches come from? There is a range. At the extreme end of each scale, data breaches come from individuals who have gone out, exploited vulnerabilities, sucked out all the personal data and then sent it over. At the other extreme range, many data breaches come from law enforcement agencies. There are many data breaches in Haverbeam Pine provided by the FBI, the NCA, the Dutch police, various different sources who provide it. so that people can learn about their exposure. And then we have everything in between, different shades of grey. Over this end, we've got security researchers working for big infosec companies who come across data in the course of their investigation. Maybe over this side, we've got people who are exchanging information backwards and forwards because they like collecting it. And somewhere in the middle, it's like, hey, I was just Googling for my name and I found a big SQL file. Let me send this to you. Particularly towards this end of the scale, people want to be anonymous for obvious reasons. The role I find myself in, I've written before about how I end up sitting between organisations and then individuals and then law enforcement agencies, and somehow trying to like juggle all the balls between everyone to try and avoid situations just like this. So the situation I find myself in is, like I said earlier on, if someone's found a vulnerability that has not been exploited, I do everything I can to not make it a data breach. When it has already happened and data has been sent, and in this case, my understanding was that multiple different parties had the data, now it's a breach. I'm not going to go through and ask people to send me identity verification or what's your real name or what's your real email address. That, getting us back to track one here, doesn't change the incident. It has happened already. What I do in every single case is I offer, in fact, I ask the individual. Sometimes it happens one way, sometimes it happens the other way. Sometimes I say to the individual, would you mind if I connect you to the organisations? Other times the organisation will say, hey, can you connect me? For example, the one in Australia that I'm doing at the moment, the one that's being handled so well, they wanted to chat to the person. The person wanted to remain anonymous. They gave me a Proton email address. Over to you guys. I believe in this case, Earth-2 knows who the individual is. They can have that discussion. It doesn't change the data. Whether or not the party is anonymous does not feature in the breach descriptions. It doesn't change the data. You failed to mention that after you sent us the data, our team confirmed with you that there are a number of unexplainable discrepancies in the data provided which did not align with the alleged claim your anonymous source was making. Now, I'll take issue with this as well. I made a note about this before because I went back through my notes. In our discussions, there were references to anomalies or discrepancies. Now, as people who've been following this product for a while know, and also if you're listening to my bit earlier on, verification of data breaches is essential. If I get given a data breach that's alleged to be from Acme Core, and I'm like, YOLO, let's just load it, and it's not from Acme Core, and it's wrong, that's bad news for Acme Core, and it could be bad news for me as well, and I don't want that. So I go through this enormously careful data verification process. And I've spoken even just earlier today about enumeration vectors, which can confirm whether the data is there or not. And of course, as we know with the case with both Dennis Kirk before and with Earth-2, reaching out to lots of people and saying, is this your data? In the case of Earth-2, I did send them that data that was sent to me as well. And at no time has anyone debated the accuracy of the data. Every time the word discrepancy or anomaly has been used, it has been used to refer to the way the party that sent me the data has communicated either with me or them. And again, I feel this puts us back in this other category, this other stream, which is there are people who are pissed for one reason or the other at Earth-2. And that's a discussion between Earth-2 and those folks. Now, there was so much opportunity over the course of what is now 22 days since I first reached out to say something in this data is wrong. And that hasn't happened. 11, you failed to mention that you're of the view that this incident is minor and that you would convey that in your messaging. Now, again, they've obviously mixed up the messaging here, so I will read. This incident did not expose any further personal information, passwords, or financial data. I did not put the words in there that this incident was minor. If you can't join those dots between saying it's only username and email address and then it didn't impact all these other things, well, then that's on you. Privately, you noted that no passwords, personal address, or financial information were leaked, something Earth-2 goes to great lengths to ensure are protected, but you did not confirm this. Like, again, guys, what are you doing? It was so clearly there in the communication that was sent almost 3 hours before this was posted. And I want to be clear too, it's not like I've done anything different with Earth-2, either in the breach description or in the tweets or anything like that. This is precisely the way every single data breach is explained. The only thing that's different about this one is their response to it, and me spending much more time than what I planned to on my Friday, sitting here talking about it. Right, so that was communicated already. Look, there's a bunch of other stuff that goes on here. I'm not even going to go into it. Suspicious discrepancies, anonymous sources. Anyway, the last paragraph here, I thought there was something of relevance in here. As we continue to review on this matter, including local and overseas authorities, we believe it is only fair that you, as a reputable source of confirmed data leaks, address the omissions in these key details, including 1 to 12 above. We are only requesting that you include the above details, which were known to you at the time, and ask you to update your message, the email to your subscribers, and publication on your website to include this information, so people have provided the full picture. What I can't even remember the last time I put it to them. It would have been sometime yesterday. What I would really like is a disclosure notice I can link to. And if I can link to it, I mean, you can say everything you want there about whether the source was anonymous or like that. That's not the point. I would caution against a disclosure notice which just attempts to blame everyone else. That normally is not received very well. And again, breach this. I'm going to put a link in the notes here. Breach Disclosure 101. Where is it? Breach Disclosure 101. This is the textbook that I have been working on so many different organizations with about how to disclose your breach. Data Breach Disclosure 101, how to succeed after you've failed. I'll go through the headlines here because they're kind of obvious. Make it easy to submit security reports. In your own minds, you can think about how much of this has actually happened here. Treat security reports with urgency. You must disclose. Disclose early. Protect accounts immediately. Not relevant in this case. Well, removing Gravatar. But go back to a sec. Obviously, they've realized that there was something within their control that could be done about the situation, which is to remove Gravatar. And they did the right thing. And kudos to them for that. They removed Gravatar. It's the right thing to do. It is then a recognition that there was something implemented there which created a risk. Avoid misdirection and false or misleading statements. Don't be vague. Incidentally, there's lots of descriptions under this. Explain what actually happened. Keep customers updated. Apologize. That blog post came out after the Red Cross Blood Service data breach. That's 2017. That's crazy. That was a very long time ago. Right, let me look at some of the comments just here. And if anyone has any questions about this, I'm happy to address them here. And then also, I've got so many other data breaches I need to go on to that I really want to get back to work. Where were we? And look, let me add something here, because I think even within these discussions here, there's a bit of argument going on. Try and keep these issues separate. The issue about this incident, this is a minor incident. I obviously don't like the way they're handling it, but it is a minor incident. If there are separate issues, whether it's about suppressing people's feedback or banning them from Discord or arguments about money or something like that, make it a separate issue, but try not to conflate these things. Because as much as I want to see organisations be transparent and honest about what's happened, I also don't want to see them being raked over the coals for something which, again, I've used this term so many times, is a nothing burger data breach. Maybe I should start putting nothing burger. Should we have a bit field on the record? It can be exposed to the API. Is breach nothing burger? Yes or no? Seek says they stopped to delete messages as soon as you join their server, allegedly. So they knew it was wrong to delete. Yet they did it. I don't like it. So I did jump on the Discord after someone had said they're deleting messages, simply because I think that's a relevant part of this narrative. I haven't been on there since yesterday. I don't have any intention to go back on there. Chris Harris, question, who is that third party? As far as I'm aware, they had in-house developers. Chris, I'm just not sure what that question relates to. Who is that third party? I think maybe what you're saying is Earth2 was saying it was a third party. My reading of their message is it's a third party authentication provider. So they might have in-house developers that, and I'm not saying it is, Authy or Auth0 or some other authentication provider platform, but I believe they're using another platform for auth. Incidentally, that is what I'd recommend you do. Good job for not holding passwords. And look, I hope people can see it. Even in my situation, they've obviously been very angry at me here. Give them credit where they're due, right? Like it is not an all bad story. Try not to lose one's mind at this. Robin asks, if my email has been pwned 14 times, should I change my email? Well, mate, I'm up to well over double that. No, don't change your email address. Someone asked me this the other day. It's a journalist. Like, should you just change your email address and go from scratch? Like, well, the old email address is still going to turn up in more data breaches. You're still going to get spam to it. And now all you're doing is you got two email addresses to appear in data breaches. So no, don't change your email address. What I would suggest, and one of the things I really like, and this is the reason Scott Helm earlier on discovered that that his email address had been used for spam purposes after it was exposed in a very specific data breach. A lot of people use either sub-addressing. So if we go back to the John at Gmail example, John plus earth2 at gmail.com. Now that's awesome. That will go through to the John alias. And then it's like John plus Netflix and John plus Spotify. Use those, then at least when it appears in a data breach somewhere, you can go, I know exactly where that came from. Or catch-all domain. Go and get your own domain name, and anything that goes to anything at that domain name.com goes to your mailbox, but then you can see what the alias is. Dalton says, so what was with the data was an anomaly then? What is relevant with it? Well, again, the term seems to be used more to apply to the way the data was reported or the person who provided it described it. I cannot find any anomalies with the data. My subscribers who I checked with cannot find any anomalies with the data. The people at Earth2 I've spoken to have not reported any anomalies with the data. To be very, very clear about that. The anomalous or the irregularities or whatever the term was seems to be with things outside the data itself. And again, I come back to the point of it, the truth is in the data. We have the data. If there are anomalies in it, let's say for argument's sake, there were loads of email addresses that didn't exist. Incidentally, every time I load a data breach, if there's even an inkling of doubt in the recipients of notifications as to the legitimacy of it, I get emails immediately, lots of them. Now, we emailed over 6,000 people yesterday, 6,000 of our subscribers, and not one single person has come back and said, I didn't have an account on this service, or something is irregular or anomalous. So this is not the issue. The data is not anomalous. Something else is. What else we got in the comments here? Dalton says they deleted the way to contact them. They deleted them after years. I'm going to try and honestly avoid the things here that just get into the points of contention where people are arguing about stuff that's, again, the wrong track. Jad Salty, really appreciate your unbiased opinion on the Earth-2 situation. Thank you for sharing your expert opinion. Comments, that's what I do. So it's not always appreciated. So thank you, that's what I do. Tradie Trev. Trade Trev's still waiting to go to the pub. It says time flies when you're having fun. What else is on here? Again, any other questions, drop it in. Callum says, yeah, Auth0. I'm not sure if you're saying, yeah, that's what they use. And again, if they do, good on them. The security workshops I've done 100 plus times now over the last 9 years, there is a module that we do around password storage and hashing mechanisms and resiliency to things like account takeover attacks and brute force. And one of the recommendations we, being Scott Helm and I, because I haven't run them for a long time. Scott does them all these days. But one of the recommendations that we strongly make is to use an authentication provider. You know, if you're an organization, and I don't even know how big Earth2 is, but if I could make an assumption, you know, they're not a Netflix or something like that. A little bit different when you're large enough to have so many security professionals that you can roll all this stuff yourself. But anyone else delegating out to an authentication provider is a good job. So yeah, biscuit for that. Well done. John says different burgers, one with the lot and one with just the bun. I think this is the nothing burger versus the significant burger. Tradie Tread says Troy has a restaurant. I want the nothing burger. It'd be good for a vegan date. Uh, uh-huh. Again, last questions. Eugene says, question, can have I been pwned be pwned? Or would be redundant since the data is already public? Yes, have I been pwned be pwned? Like anything can be. I'm not saying that this is Earth 2 situation, but many organizations do get to the point where they're like, well, we're unhackable, or like just, I don't know, like motherhood statements which just have no basis in fact. There is a possibility, have I been pwned? So what do we do to, if we look at it from a risk management perspective, what do we do to A, reduce the likelihood of it happening, and B, reduce the impact of it does? Likelihood is all the obvious stuff around secure development practices. Stefan and I are the two that write code. Stefan has been to my secure development workshop. That's how we met in the first place. I feel like Stefan's gone to bed now. Oh, no, he's still there. He's still there with the burger. Sorry, mate. All of those practices are in place. We wrap everything behind Cloudflare as well. They've got some really, really cool security controls that help support us there too. In terms of then making sure that if it was to happen, we have mitigating controls. One of the reasons the only data that goes into Have I Been Pwned is email addresses, and totally separately detached from that, there's the Pwned Password Service. One of the reasons it's only email addresses is that if Have I Been Pwned gets owned sideways, it's email addresses. Like that's it. If I was to go through every other piece of data we collect and think about where the risks are, first of all, the data breaches themselves, everything goes off to cold storage. It's only email addresses on the online service. We have 5 million other people that have given us their email address so we can notify them when they're in a data breach. We have people doing domain searches, and we have an association between their email address and the domain. We have customers that have purchased API keys and domain subscriptions. They're in Stripe. They have a name, they have an email address, they have a physical address, they have the last 4 digits of their credit card. That's all in Stripe. And again, if Stripe gets owned, I've got to take accountability of notifying my customers. So that is a risk. That is probably our greatest risk. So we have to protect Stripe keys and things like that. So yes, it is possible. It would be very embarrassing. It'd be easy to load the data. I would not like to send 5 million emails to people saying you've been in a data breach. It's it's us. So that was a good question though. JD says, thanks for doing the whole thing. Hope they end up disclosing it, but not counting it. Look, I think to start to wind this up, they effectively have now disclosed it. It's there in their public statement. And whilst I disagree with things that are there, they have not pushed back on the fact that it happens. And evidently, by removing that Gravatar component, they've recognized that that was the risk that was created. So this might be the most that you get for the folks looking at this going, I'd like to see a full thing. And that is now out there. That is now public recognition that this incident did happen. And now there's this whole separate thread, again, which you guys have got to take up with them about all your other issues that are unrelated to the breach itself. But there is now a public acknowledgement that that data was exposed. All right. Still going through this. It is interesting. Like when I go through and I look at a data breach for a service I've never heard of before, I do learn a lot. And I've found a whole other community here that I never knew about. It's like the other day. It's like there was a whole community of people creating AI-generated sex images and so. Anyway, so the point is you get exposed to many different things. Again, I'm going to skip through the stuff that, frankly, is just unnecessary noise. If there's questions about the data breach in general, Australian trivia, whatever it may be, hit me with it. I just got a reminder. Oh, I have a meeting. What do I get a meeting reminder for? Aaron. Hi, Troy. Did you hear about Amazon Trust Services will stop cross-signing for Starfield Root CA? Google will be removing the Starfield from the trust. Isn't it nice to have a more traditional InfoSec question? I hadn't heard about that. No, thank you. That's news. I'll put that on my list of things that I will never have time to read. JD says, feels like it would be more productive to stop trying to attack the source of the data breach and just deal with it. It is a natural reaction, in fairness. And again, the Nothing Burger caveat in mind, if we talk about other more serious, like let's talk about the Snowflake stuff from earlier on. I mean, that is a case where someone has done huge amounts of damage with malice, with the intent of cashing in by ransoming all these companies. It is perfectly understandable for people to be totally pissed at that guy and go after him. And of course, assuming this is the right guy, he is now arrested. In a case like this, as far as it relates to the exposure of this data, again, Nothing Burger, it does seem unnecessary. That's just me. Aussie one. I really like your style of sticking to the facts. I do think you might be onto something with providing a category of how bad a breach is for end user data and providing definitions for them. Well, this is why we have data classes. I'm going to drop a link in here. In fact, this is the link. Don't know if I put this in earlier or not. This is a link directly through to the Earth 2 description, but you'll see for every single data breach in here, there is a collection of compromised data. Now, this one, of course, is just email addresses and usernames. You go to the one below that, and it's E2Go. That had email addresses, genders, names, passwords, phone numbers, social media profiles. The next one's Eat Street. I'm not even going to read them all. Dates of birth, addresses, genders, names, partial credit card data. The impact side of things, first of all, I would argue people can read the compromised data and then conclude for themselves what that impact is. Secondly, of course, we could automate this. We have all of this data. We could have some sort of a rating scale where if it's, for argument's sake, it's Earth 2, it's in the Nothing Burger category. Maybe the burger just gets bigger as we go. Hey, there's an API, someone can build that. Fun challenge, build an API to look at all the data breaches and the burger builds up as the data breach gets bigger, and then we just have different burger sizes. You put them all in there. Also, I would argue that there is some subjectivity to this as well. What's a good example of this? So think about something like a health website. If there is a health-related website, the impact on some people, a health-related data breach, may be bigger than others. Vistamo, so someone mentioned the Finnish psychotherapy service earlier on. If someone has gone there for some general counselling advice because they're having a rough week, that is a different category to someone who's gone there because they have thoughts of self-harm or they're suffering with serious mental illness or something like that. So the impact can be really different person by person depending on the individual, even when it's the same class as the data that exposed. E2 Insights says, would you say that the breach is so insignificant that anyone who is trying to emphasize it is scaremongering and perhaps has an agenda or an engaging in yellow reporting? What's yellow reporting? Oh, I get the idea. I think you could say that it would be very easy for people to use this for scaremongering. I agree with that. I think if you were to say that this is going to cause all sorts of serious harm and damage, etc., that would be scaremongering. I also think that if you say it's of no significance whatsoever, then you're out of step with the 85% of people who said it is. There's a balance here, somewhere in between. I'd much rather stop talking about terms like scaremongering and danger and everything else and talk about what does it actually mean? What is the risk of having email address and username exposed associated to a service? And I've outlined some of these already. I don't know when you dropped in here. The possible phishing. Well, we all get phishing attacks all the day, every day. It's a bit worse when someone knows that you're a user of a particular service and you can start to target your phishing emails towards that person. It's easy as an individual, of course, to avoid this. Don't click on phishing links. But that's much easier if you know that your data has just been exposed. So I don't think this is a major incident at all. I've said that over and over and over again. That's very clear from the fact it's just usernames and email addresses. And to your point, yeah, let's say it's scaremongering if you say it is a major incident. It's not. I hope we're actually found some common ground there. Value, I appreciate professionalism in this Troy. It's good to know that it's nothing serious. Yeah. Tradie Trev still wants to go to the pub. You and I should do that one day, Trev. We'll just screw it. We'll take this down to the pub. Stefan's going to bed. I knew you'd expire eventually, Stefan. Thank you, mate, for joining. Dalton says, we can see the person who got the data did not have malice. I don't want to speak to the person's motives. Honestly, I don't ask. I really do not ask for the motives, because the motive doesn't change the data itself. And it's the data itself that we're focused on. Dalton says, why try to disclose it instead of exploit the data? Disclosure of the data do not harm the platform. It's a long bow to draw to exploit usernames and passwords. Look, it's different if you have email addresses and passwords in plain text. What's your exploitability then? Well, it's account takeovers, both on that platform and then everywhere else that people have reused that same credentials pair. Again, the extent of concern here would be targeted spam / phishing. And also, as we said before, there are different motives for individuals to provide data. And I did not ask the motive in this case. I'm more focused on the data. But one of the motives from individuals is very often that they want an organization to acknowledge an incident. Now, if that is the motive of the party that sent it to me, well, then that is not something that they would then seek to monetize. Rod says ratings get quite subjective, yeah, which is kind of the point I just made. What else is here? Again, I'm not going to get sucked into the other thread controversy stuff. Trader Trev says, Troy, you do windsurfing. That's a danger point itself. People. Fun story. I'm going to finish on a fun story. Now that Tradie Trevor's raised the windsurfing thing. I haven't windsurfed since shortly after I moved to the Gold Coast. I want to say probably about 6 or 7 years ago. I was passionate. I was convinced I was going to be a professional windsurfer, and I was completely wrong. But that never happened. But I loved it. In fact, only a few years ago, I just threw out everything that was left because it was like literally moldy in a shed somewhere. There's lots of other things I do that are high risk. The jet ski. Now, here's my jet ski story of the week. I have had a reputation for destroying jet skis, not necessarily through any fault of my own. And we had an incident this week. So we live in a place here on the Gold Coast. So as you're from other parts of the world, I imagine it's a bit like Florida. I've never been to Florida. But you've got probably 10,000 plus houses that are on man-made canals, including ours, and a lot of people have a jet ski. So the other day, I'm out on my jet ski. I'm with one of my mates a couple of doors down, and we were out cruising around. We were out in the ocean. We were driving around South Stradbroke Island. Awesome time. Get around the island, sit down, have a cold beer, light beer. It's nice. Jump on the jet ski, driving home, and suddenly it starts losing power. And this is a ski I bought in January, almost brand new ski. Starts losing power, and I pull over on a sandbank, and I'm like, well, I've sucked up a plastic bag or a seaweed or a dolphin or something like that. I'll just turn it off and I'll pull it out of the bottom, and we don't suck up dolphins, don't worry. And it will be fine. But anyway, long story short, like I'm giving it throttle and it's doing like 5,500 RPM and 8 kilometers an hour. So something's really, really wrong. Like the drive obviously isn't going through to the impeller. So I call up the shop we bought it from and limp it to a boat ramp. They take it away, and the next day they call up and go, well, what happened on your new jet ski has got like 40 hours on it is the impeller itself has detached from the drive shaft, and the impeller is like a big screw, because normally it's got water in it. It pushes the water back out through the jet, and that screw has managed to start working its way up the drive shaft and start eating out the fiberglass of the hull and continued towards the engine such that it's lifted the engine off the mounts and broken the engine mounts as well. We're going to give you a new jet ski. So that was maybe Tradie Trevor's not the exact story you're thinking of. The windsurfing problems have gone. That is now the 4th jet ski I've had the displeasure of writing off in one way or another. My new one, I'm hoping they call me today and go, my new one's ready. So there's my jet ski fun story of the week. Thanks, folks, for joining in. I know this has been super long. I hope I've given a lot of colour, particularly around the Earth 2 stuff, and look at it in the context of those other incidents and the way these data breaches normally get processed and play out as well. Thanks, folks.